My name is John Colley, and I'm the Director of Programs and Operations at the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation. On behalf of the Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar entitled, Building on Failure, Learning When Things Go Wrong. When I think of the word failure, I have two conflicting reactions. One is connected with a negative judgment. Failure can make me feel vulnerable and inadequate, like you remember from school. If you ever took home a test or something that had fail on it, it probably didn't make you feel very good. My other reaction, though, is connected with my experience of trying new things and testing myself. It can be exhilarating. Learning from failure could push me out of my comfort zone to be creative and to take more risks. The Foundation's interest in failure stems from our focus on social innovation. The Foundation seeks not just to solve social problems, but to influence the systems that created those challenges in the first place. It means that we and our partners and grantees are often in uncharted territory, experimenting with new models. To use Henry Mintzberg's expression, employing a deliberately emergent strategy, one in which we design prototypes, test them in the field, and learn from our mistakes and try again. As Buckminster Fuller once said, there's no such thing as a failed experiment, only experiments with unexpected outcomes. He might have added that the real failure is the inability to learn from that experience. A couple of years ago, Janice Stein was addressing a gathering of Canadian foundations, and I remember that she challenged us to identify our most significant failures for that year. Her point was that if you did not have any, you probably were not doing anything very interesting or innovative. Today, we're very pleased to have two knowledgeable resource people who are going to speak to this issue. I would like to introduce you to Ashley Good. Ashley has launched admittingfailure.com, and she has built a career around being an expert on failure, or more specifically, learning from it. Her work on failure has received coverage in a wide range of media and news outlets, including Stanford Social Innovation Review, The Guardian, Harvard University, TED Talks, and most recently, BBC World. We're also pleased to have with us an old friend of the Foundation, Natasha Blanchet-Cohen, who is an assistant professor at Concordia University's Department of Applied Human Sciences. From 1997 to 2009, she worked as a research director at the International Institute for Child Rights and Development in Victoria. She has led national applied research initiatives on building resilient communities through youth engagement, including YouthScape and Growing Up in Cities Canada that the Foundation was involved with. So I'd like to turn it over to Ashley now, who is going to speak for about 15 minutes on how to fail forward.
Thanks for the introduction, John. We have a conundrum. It is really hard to talk about failures, and it's painful to acknowledge when we don't meet our goals and objectives, and particularly to the social sector, we worry about how our funders will react. The paradox of this conundrum is that we all know that failure is the best teacher. We have to talk about failures in order to learn from them. And more than that, acknowledging failure is often a catalyst for innovation that takes our work from good to great. And Natasha will speak more to this shortly. But talking about failure helps our organizations by providing the motivation to learn, as well as a means to get better and better at learning and innovating to ever improve the effectiveness of the work that we do. So since it is so hard to talk about failures, and yet so vital to our work, I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about what you can do and what we can do to make it easier to talk about and learn from our failures. And I like to call this failing forward. And I use this term failing forward because we often think about failing as a look back, while failing forward is about using that look back in order to get better going forward in the future. Currently, failure is the elephant in the room. We all know that we fail, but rarely do we talk about it. So how do we make it easier to draw attention to the elephant? How do we encourage our organizations to talk about failure and fail forward? So first of all, I should address what it means to talk about failure. It's as simple as having a dialogue around three very practical questions. What isn't working? why isn't it working, and what can we do better. Using the word failure is or can be dangerous as it makes it seem like it's a black and white issue, when really we all know that projects come with some element of failure as well as success. And I call failure the elephant in the room because that failure part often gets dismissed or glossed over. But we know it's there, and many of us would like to ask those 3 questions about what isn't working more thoroughly. So in this talk, I will present some ideas on getting over the risk and creating the space so we can have that dialogue about what isn't working and allow ourselves to fail forward. In my work supporting organizational learning in the social sector and beyond, I've seen 3 foundational elements that help organizations fail forward. These are building community around talking about failure, learning and adapting to failures, and using an acceptance of failure to nurture innovation. I base this talk around those 3 elements and how each element contributes to our ability to talk about and learn from our failures. The first foundational element here of failing forward is build community. My goal for sharing this element with you is to demonstrate that you're not alone. There are many of us working away at our jobs, hoping to have, even yearning for, a more honest, grown-up conversation about failures. Engineers Without Borders Canada has role modeled this with their failure report. And I'd like to briefly share the story of Engineers Without Borders to provide a great example of how there are other organizations and individuals working towards social change that are successful while also being explicit about their shortcomings. So the first EWB failure report was published in 2008. It was a bold step, a definite risk, but their volunteers in Africa wanted to make sure that what they were learning was shared widely so that future volunteers wouldn't make those same mistakes. And this was really brave stuff at the time. As you well know, many donors have strict requirements for results and so can be intolerant of failures. So those EWBers who wrote the first failure report knew it might cause them to lose some donor support. But they took that risk because the benefits of transparency and learning outweighed the risk of losing donors. And what's more, EWB believed that they could build trust and credibility with their donors by showing that their failures were being recognized and the resulting lessons learned extracted, shared, and incorporated into their operations. So I've led this failure report initiative for EWB for a number of years now and see that ultimately through this report they have changed the conversation with their donors. They're saying that there is failure and success in everything that they do, and they are dedicated to learning from their failures, not hiding them. And I was in northern Ghana with EWB at the time the first failure report was published and was totally inspired by what was possible if it spread across the sector. I saw that a more open discussion on failure would help the farmers I was working with have access to projects that didn't repeat past mistakes. I was so inspired that when I got back to Canada, I was asked to run EWB's failure report and launched Admitting Failure. Now, unlike the failure report, which is internal to EWB, Admitting Failure tries to build a community in the sector to show people in organizations, just like you, who want to talk about failure, that they are not alone. And if I'm honest, I was super worried that people would think I was crazy when I launched this site. But I decided to send a note to Bill Gates Sr., the co-chair of the Gates Foundation anyway. Much to my surprise and delight, he agreed to contribute a piece about failure. And encouraged by that initial win, I decided to bring the idea to a couple other NGOs. And the next 3 organizations I spoke with all loved the concept and enthusiastically shared their own failure stories for the launch. And all of a sudden, it wasn't about my experience with failure or even Engineers Without Borders. It was a community coming together to say we want to and we need to be a part of creating a sector where it's okay to talk about and learn from our failures. So what has been the effect of building community? Well, say before no one was really talking about failure. Now you have hugely influential organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Charity Water, and USAID publishing their failures publicly. Before, donors wanted to be ignorant of challenges. Now they congratulate their grantees on being open about them and sharing what they're learning. And before, media would focus on the black and white successes and failures. Now there's a much more nuanced conversation about the value in discussing failure in the social sector. It requires an incredible amount of courage to question this blanket of idealism and good intentions in the social sector. But organizations like EWB, certainly all of those organizations with whom I'm currently working, and of course those who have published stories to admittingfailure.com, prove that this change is possible. So I encourage everyone watching this to join in and be a part of creating this change towards failing forward. Which brings me to the second foundational element of failing forward, which is to learn and adapt to our failures. But before you can learn and adapt, you have to know what works. Coming back to those three questions I posed at the beginning, what isn't working? Why isn't it working? What can we do better? So why can't we have this conversation? And what I've seen is that it's because we don't have a safe space. There's a challenge, this is the challenge that prevents us from even starting to learn and adapt to our failures. And it stems from the very real fear we associate with failure. The status quo is built on talking about successes. So when we openly acknowledge our failures, we put ourselves at risk of being blamed and punished. But it is this intolerance of failure that drives the learning underground. So in order to make learning and adapting possible, we need to build a safe space. I hope this presentation inspires you to start building a space at your organization, and for this purpose, you will find activities which accompany the webinar. These are intended to help you take that first step in talking about failure in order to learn and adapt to it. For example, one of these activities helps participants understand how our perspective on failure can be reframed in a more positive light to encourage learning. There are a number of organizational norms and characteristics listed here that help overcome this challenge of creating a safe space and encourage our organizations to learn and adapt to failures. How to build these into your organization could easily be another 7 webinars all on their own. So I'm afraid this list will seem rather unsatisfactory for now. I've listed these 7 characteristics here for your reference. The webinar will stay available, so feel free to come back to this list and revisit them to discuss and explore what these may mean within your own organization. Finally, the third element of failing forward is innovation. We all want to innovate, and we all know that the problems we face require innovation to solve them. In social change, as in the rest of the world, these problems that we're trying to solve are becoming increasingly complex. Fortunately, the world is full of endlessly creative, resourceful, and innovative individuals working to create the great changes that are needed. So we are a part of building a tolerance and acceptance for failure, because nothing great was ever accomplished without taking a risk. And unless you're incredibly lucky, we all know risk comes with some failure. So last but not least, I hope that this talk sparks innovation. The complex problems we're all working on require innovation to solve them. Innovation involves risk. The more innovation needed, the higher the risk, the greater the chance of failure. So without discussing failure more openly, we're simply unlikely to try the riskier solutions that are needed to create the social change that we want to see. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, but as I mentioned earlier, it's really just the start. This kind of change is hard and is slow, and I recognize that every organization is different and has its own set of challenges and bottlenecks to failing forward, but you've already taken the first step. From here, you can download the workshops, test them out with your own organization, even in the spirit of continuous improvement, make them better and share them back with me. And feel free just to get in touch. Let me know where your organization is at and how you'd like to take this further, because we have a choice. Failure can remain the elephant in the room, dismissed and ignored, or we can use it as a key that has great power when used well to unlock organizational potential and improve the effectiveness of the work we do. At EWB, I asked 3 questions. What isn't working? Why isn't it working? Well, what can we do better? And the failure report got everyone in the organization asking those questions publicly and transparently. So I will ask you, what questions does your organization need to ask?
Great. Thanks very much, Ashley. Thanks for both the model that you shared with us and your stories from Engineers Without Borders and several other organizations. I just wanted to, before we move to Natasha, I just wanted to follow up with a couple of questions. You spoke at the beginning about, how to create the environment inside an organization. But I'd just like to push that a little bit because, asking people to talk about their failures in their work, for a lot of people, that's a very insecure and vulnerable space. So how do you actually practically create that safe space for people to share honestly about their failures? Because it's something that we are, in fact, the norm of most organizations, as you pointed out, is against that.
Certainly. I've seen 3 points of leverage for creating a safe space within an organization. The first point of leverage is through leadership. So this would look like leadership of the organization encouraging and supporting, talking about failures and role modeling this behavior. And I saw this when, an example is when Scott Gilmore, the CEO of Building Markets, did this when he personally wrote his organization's first failure report, which was essentially a list of his own management failures. The second point of leverage for creating that safe space is more representative of the EWB example, where the safe space was created not by leadership, but by individuals within the organization forming a group or a practice around talking about failure. And the third point of leverage for creating the safe space is through organizational processes or structures, which can look like rewarding or otherwise incentivizing those people who talk about and learn from their failures. For example, performance reviews can contain a learning from failure element as a criteria for evaluation. So those are the 3 points of leverage for creating that safe space. I would recommend just picking one that is the easiest for your specific context at your organization and starting from there, because you can create a safe space with just one. And as you work with that one, you can build the other 2, and that will just ensure that the space becomes all the more entrenched in the organization's culture. What I should say is that I know that I talk about it like it's easy when I know that isn't the case. It takes a lot of courage, a lot of effort, and small steps to get there. But by focusing on your organization's leadership or building that grassroots practice or adapting your organization's existing processes, it at least gives you a place to start.
Okay, great, thanks. And I would add that, our experience at the foundation is that more and more organizations are actually getting better at living the values, if you like, of their organization and surfacing those failures and creating safe space for that inside their organization. But my second question is about outside the organization, which is another step altogether. I would think for senior leadership in most organizations, I think that the environment for funding, whether it's from government or foundations or even private donors, is getting more competitive all the time, and people, generally speaking, are saying, we want evidence of your success before we would consider funding you. So is there not a potential for negative repercussions if an organization is open about its failures?
Certainly that potential exists. But what I have seen in my work is that this is much more of a perceived and not a real risk. What I've seen is that funders really appreciate how challenging our work can be. They know that innovation requires a learn by doing approach and value that open dialogue around what is being learned along the way. I also see a desire amongst most funders to have a more authentic and trusting relationship with the people they fund. And this means that organizations can take the risk to talk about what is working and what is failing. But honestly, I mean, you can ignore everything I just said, and maybe this is just my idealism showing through, but in order to learn and do great work and continuously improve the work we do, it requires talking about our failures. And if funders don't like that, then that sucks. But our main goal is creating change. And truly, I want the organizations I work with to be the most effective that they can be and create the most social change that is possible. And talking openly about our failures unlocks the potential to do this. Talking about and learning from failures, in my view, increases your competitiveness and attractiveness to funders because it demonstrates that healthy disregard for the status quo, that drive to continuously get better and improve, and a dedication to always doing ever more exceptional work. And that is the kind of organization, that's certainly the kind of people that funders want to give money to.
Ashley, I admire your spunk in challenging the status quo around perceptions around failure and success. And I think there are some funders who are there, and it'll be people like you who are pushing some of the other funders. I was thinking particularly of government who, failure is not often what they want to see, but you're right. If they're serious about moving into innovative spaces as they say they are, I think they're going to have to move as well. So now I'd like to introduce Natasha, who is going to speak about some of the same principles, but specifically is going to speak about learning from failure from the case of YouthScape, which was a program that we were very pleased to collaborate with the International Institute for Child Rights and Development on a few years ago. Natasha, take it away.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I must begin by saying that, like John, initially I struggled with the word failure because it did give a bad connotation evoked related to school. Failure wasn't a good news and really disempowering and certainly not something to hope for. But the notion of failure was also disturbing for me, someone who advocates the value of starting from strength, of seeing an asset-based approach to community change as critical. But as I worked with this concept, applying it to the experience of YouthScape, I realized that we did admit failure without ever mentioning the word and that it was useful. So let me explain how that was the case. Because unlike Ashley, I'm not an expert on admitting failure, so I'm really applying this concept, and I hope that you can perhaps see, as I did, why failure must not be feared, but rather embraced. First of all, though, a little bit of background on YouthScape to situate you. Well, first, this was a national initiative funded partially by the McConnell Foundation over 4 years. It was a significant funding, around $2 million. For the foundation, it was part of their inclusion strategy to support young people disconnected from school and other mainstream organizations led by adults. I mean, let us be reminded that young people below the age of 18 in Canada are really not recognized as valuable members of community, even less so marginalized youth. And really, if we don't include them, they may very well claim that right, but not necessarily in the most peaceful ways. So investing in youth is important for everyone's well-being. YouthScape brought together 5 communities across the country with a whole range of convening organizations, including United Way Thunder Bay, Child Youth Friendly Calgary, Heartwood Centre for Community Youth Development in Halifax, Baskerville 2000 in Rivière-des-Prairies on the island of Montreal, Youth Corps in Victoria, as well as Children for Change in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Integral also to the initiative was supporting a national convener, the International Institute for Child Rights and Development at the University of Victoria in BC, that was responsible for management, creating a learning community, and documenting learnings. My reflections today are based on my position at the time within IICRD, so it was very much an insider, which is important to keep in mind in my points. There was also a developmental evaluator who supported the national project, as well as part-time DEs in the local sites, a requirement for each site, which I will return to later on as an important element. I would argue that this project was particularly a fertile ground for quote-unquote failure. It involved changing practices, required innovation. After all, our vision was big. It really was a big dream. We were talking about imagine creating a society where the engagement of young people is an automatic reflex. More specifically, the project was risky and therefore subject to failure because we were talking about involving youth, particularly marginalized youth, as partners in community, which is really revolutionary in a youth-serving sector that has an overwhelming deficit mentality and considers youth as clients of programs and services, certainly not as partners. We were talking about bringing together many organizations and institutions, public, private, NGOs, which affect young people's lives but rarely work together. The youth sector generally operates in silos, with youth services and programs being delivered independently. In our approaches, we were advocating for new ways of working with youth, and this process required a change in the relationship between institutions and young people to better resonate with the ways young people were working and to draw upon their skills. And I like this quote of a young person who said, "We don't want to be sitting around the board table, boring. We want to join with you and others in creating a circle where we explore new relationships and ways of taking action in our community." So we wanted new ways of working. The idea of youth grants, for instance, of directly giving money to marginalized youth to implement their ideas for community action was really quite novel. We were talking about taking the leap. There was a fear that young people would run away with money and that they did not have the capacity to be held accountable. So, given this background, despite this fertile ground for failure, the project was a success, and I will come back to how so later. But along the way, we encountered failure. And what I want to explain now is how admitting this so-called failure was actually useful to advancing the goals of the project. Instead of stalling the project, it actually opened the way to success, very much like the last slide you saw from Ashley's presentation. So let me give you a few examples how it opened the potential. Admitting failure allowed us to pause, which permitted us to shift the strategies and revisit the project activities. After 1 year, we realized that, wow, so much time was spent in establishing committees and talking about setting up the structures, but really, where were the youth? If you consider failure to happen when you, quote unquote, do not meet the intended objectives, which is actually the definition of failure in the dictionary, well, we surely were not passing. After all, this project was intended to create community resilience through youth engagement, and youth were not there. So we had to pause, and the project had to shift gears and refocus. What did we end up doing? 3 communities disbanded with steering committees, replacing them with more creative and adequate structures where youth could truly participate. To provide for the action, priority was placed on the disbursement of youth grants, which really helped to bring youth center stage. And part of it, there was also a price to pay, with one community actually pulling out, realizing that they did not have the capacity. The timing was not right for them to really move forward with the objective of the project. It was hard to take that decision, and may not have happened if there was not this valuing of transparency. But in the end, it was purposeful and useful for the project because that money was shifted to another community that was more ready. Another way that admitting failure was useful was in making us reflect on the meaning of success. There was a sense of failure at certain points in the project and feeling that we were not always achieving the scope of transformation that we had hoped for. A staff member expressed the disappointment metaphorically. We ordered Cadillacs, but we got a rusty '87 Toyota. Early on, getting that rusty Toyota was considered a failure, but in pausing, we reconsidered the meaning we were giving to success. Maybe youth were not being as revolutionary with their ideas as we had expected, but these individual changes were creating sparks and ripples that were impactful as a whole, although not always easy to measure individually, independently. A third way that the value of admitting failure was significant and helpful is that it forced communities to be more intentional in making the changes that reflected what this project was supposed to be doing. This was the case, for instance, with moving towards greater collective ownership by the community organization. At some point during the project, it was held really too much within the convening organization, often even limited under the control of the paid coordinator. So we really weren't seeing the comprehensive intent of this project. Realizing this, and to give meaning to the comprehensive nature of the project, communities explored different models of management. So given the complexity of the project, the number of players, the uncertainty on how the milieu would respond to different interventions, I would say that failure was almost unavoidable. It would have been impossible to conceive of a logic model that predicted that specific activities would lead to such and such outcome. Failure was integral to adaptation. And it was really temporary periods of failures which forced the project to shift or reassess itself. Recognizing them was key in accounting for our eventual success. And I'd like to, show why this project was actually successful. The fact that there were lots of individual changes within the youth and the supporting adults, providing for increased self-esteem, skill building, and partnership. As you see from this picture drawn by Lisa, there were lots of light bulbs. There were also some institutional and systemic changes. Youth Action Council in Thunder Bay and Community Foundation in Thunder Bay integrating youth-led granting. In Rivière-des-Prairies, new forms of youth decision-making were integrated into mainstream organizations. In Calgary, the transportation system recognized that as users of these services, youth needed to be involved in the routing, in any decisions around changing fares. In Halifax, the municipality influenced their approach to youth engagement. In Victoria, a platform was created for youth-serving organizations to exchange information. There was also multiple benefits in terms of production of articles and new knowledge, numerous publications contributing to the field, 3 guidebooks, 5 academic articles, all of which are accessible on the McConnell's website or YouthScape. So the sparks and ripples were considerable. And in retrospect, embracing failure actually made that success possible. So while the word failure evokes doom and negativity, one can see how acknowledging failure can actually provoke positive change. And I'd like to conclude with a quote from Getting to Maybe, where Francis Wesley, Brenda Zimmerman, and Michael Clint Patton analyze stories of social innovators. And they make the observation, and quote unquote, the only lasting failure is the failure to learn and to apply that learning going forward. This quote I have found very captivating because it both normalizes failure but also calls for action, reminding us that we need to respond to failure, and I think that's what's really significant. So after all, failure is not a deficit approach, but integrating into programming becomes a way of challenging ourselves to go a notch further. And that challenge I would pose to all of us involved in these increasingly complex projects, such as YouthScape, but in many other fields, where embracing failure is necessary, and we need to develop the skills for failure to emerge and to be able to respond to that failure.
Thanks, Natasha. I'd just like to dig a little deeper, particularly because we both know a lot about YouthScape, but I think there's some things you might be able to share for the listeners about some aspects of it. So my question to you is, in retrospect, what were the conditions within YouthScape, that could be mechanisms, practices, that allowed for the failures to open the way to success and then later on more lasting change?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. The importance, I would begin by talking about the importance of creating a safe place where it's not only okay, but even encouraged to admit failure. And I'm actually going to begin by talking about the importance of the funder as playing a really important role. And I haven't been paid for saying this at all, but I think it's important to make the point that the fact that the funder was actually interested in learning, in remaining engaged in the project management throughout was key. The reports to the funder weren't about telling the stories of what happened, but why it happened, what did not happen as expected. It was not about portraying a glorified summative report. And these reports were not just tucked into the program manager's drawers. Individual reports were commented on with specific feedback, and general shifts in program communicated as a result of what was said in these reports. Of course, it wasn't always rosy, and at times the openness that was being requested from organizations was resisted. So I think it's really important that both the funder feels comfortable in allowing for that flexibility and moving away from a conventional way of operating where usually the funder makes a call for proposal with established criteria, communities respond to these, implements them, and reports back. So bringing about that social innovation, allowing for that failure, requires failures to allow for the learning to happen and that to have a two-directional relationship. Another condition, though, I think, was allowing for exploring alternative approaches to evaluation that actually support learning. Conventional approaches to evaluation would actually be a disservice to projects like YouthScape. It would be impossible to have a pre-established program logic to follow. In this instance, in the case of YouthScape, we found great value in developmental evaluation, particularly at the beginning of the project, to provide the right time feedback necessary for supporting adaptation and reorganization in such a highly dynamic, multidimensional, and interdependent milieu. So I think funders need to recognize the value of alternative forms of evaluation, such as DE, and we also need to have people who are skilled in this type of evaluation. The last point that I think I'd like to say is around emphasizing the importance of the project as a whole to take the time to establish principles that can guide a project to deal with finding their way out of failure, so to speak, to serve as benchmarks. And in the case of YouthScape, we called them guideposts. They were built collectively at the beginning of the project, and they were really helpful in guiding us to examine, pause, and act upon what wasn't working and the failures that we were experiencing. This was really necessary to maintain that bigger picture and not get lost in the minutia, which is a risk in complex projects.
Thanks, Natasha. As we come towards the close of this session, I'd actually like to ask both of you a question. I'm struck by the word failure and how it can actually be a very useful lens, because it makes us feel uncomfortable, and I think certainly Ashley talked about that, and Natasha and I, viscerally talked about it, as you're growing up. It's something that makes you squirm a bit, or to put it in Ashley's terms, it's the elephant in the room. And from my experience of doing a lot of adult education, it's actually when people are feeling uncomfortable, it usually means you're actually getting somewhere in terms of learning. But having said that, I'm still asking myself, are the negative connotations of failure, useful as it is as a sort of a provocative way of getting people to discuss things that they'd rather not, is there a way, though, eventually that we need to get beyond that? Because both of you have talked about how, in fact, framing it as this source of inspiration, of creativity and innovation And do we not want to eventually sort of move beyond the framing of failure with all its negativity and the sort of deficit mentality and actually see it in a positive way? But I don't know quite how we would get there without losing the advantages that the word failure brings to the table.
I'll hop in there, John. I have a fairly short and defiant answer to the question of using the word failure. I do think it evokes emotions and often negative ones, but I think that's where its power lies. Because it is so provocative a word, it sparks the dialogue that is needed. And once that conversation and that openness about what is and isn't working is there, then I don't necessarily think we have to continue to use the word failure. But for my purposes and my work, I stick by it because currently I don't think those conversations are happening as on a widespread basis as they could be, and failures are being repeated. And I think that the element of disruption or provocation that the word failure instills is needed to create that change and create the dialogue that's necessary to learn and improve.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with Ashley in the sense that given the context where we're at right now, where there's such a resistance to explore failure and to see the value of failure, that it's a much more effective term than to be talking about learning, which could be another synonym of admitting failure. I think it's using the language that has the power, but with a twist, sort of using the language of the powerful. And I think in that way, it's opening the way for more change that can allow program development to go a notch further.
I'd like to thank Ashley and Natasha for their thought-provoking presentations. I think they've given us all a lot to think about as we move forward as organizations and as a community sector. What I took away from it was that surfacing and articulating, which are two different things, failure can be a key component of being an effective learning organization, both for improving your own practice inside, but also contributing to the knowledge of others in the field, whether it be practitioners, researchers, philanthropists, government. And I'm struck by how one of the things we all need to work on is changing the sort of culture around failure. And that means individuals, organizations, governments, donors, and other stakeholders recognizing that failure is a part of every enterprise, so not to pretend that it isn't, but that it also is a precondition for genuine innovation. I remember once hearing about, obviously not in the flesh, but reading about Thomas Edison when he was interviewed about after he had invented the light bulb, and one of the greatest inventors of all time just said, well, the key to my success was thousands of failures. So if you're interested in this topic, I would invite you to contact Ashley at admittingfailure.com and to check out the activities that were designed to help organizations talk about failure in a constructive manner that are on the website. So thank you, everyone, for being on the call, and have a good day.